All right, good morning, good midday, good afternoon, good evening to everybody to our today's Zoom webinar discussion on the topic, a peaceful solution for Ukraine. My name is Stephanie FENKART and I'm the director of the International Institute for Peace, and together with Neutrality Studies and its initiator, I would even say PASCAL LOTTAZ, I'm going to moderate the discussion today. Maybe I just want to give like a very short overview before we go and enter the discussion. I would ask everyone, since it's a huge panel, to stick to around 7 minutes so that we still have time for discussion. I think it's going to be feasible, and I look forward to all your insights and your ideas on this topic, which I would say quite unfortunately is so high on the agenda these days, not only in the US, but also here in Europe, and I'm pretty sure also when it comes more to the East. All of us, we know that the build-up of troops on the eastern border of Ukraine it's not the first time that this is happening. I mean, we already saw a similar building up of troops last year in the beginning, in spring, I would say. And now we see like the tension is like even bigger, that the red line seems to have been somehow moved from not only challenging NATO enlargement in general, but also when it comes to the troops of NATO stationed already in the eastern part and NATO members like in Poland and the Baltic states. We recently saw a lot of talks in Geneva between Russia and the US, in Geneva, in Brussels, also in Vienna, where they tried to come to a compromise, how to deal with the situation, how come to probably a compromise. And until now, I would say there is not really a lot of success what we could have been witnessing. Taking into account, of course, that the conflict in Russia, in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia is a multi-layered one, where also identity plays a big role. We speak a lot about sovereignty, about history. We still want to discuss what possible solutions there could be to resolve the crisis peacefully. In this talk, we want to discuss also what role the European Union could play, and if neutrality, for example, based on international law, is an option to ease the tensions and to prevent a violent escalation. Pascal and me will be moderating together, and I will already give him the floor for a very short introduction. And I ask all the people and all the participants, please submit questions in the Q&A section. Section. We will go through it during the talks, and I now already hand over to Pascal to introduce the first speakers. And let me thank you again for the cooperation. I really look forward that all of you actually made it today to discuss these very important issues. Pascal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and welcome everybody also from my side. I am Pascal Lotta. I'm an assistant professor at the Waseda Institute for Advanced Study here in beautiful Tokyo. And I got an email about a month ago from Klaus Lares, who published a wonderful essay by Ambassador Jack Matlock, who wrote very critically about the problems that Ukraine is facing today. And taking this as a starting point, I reached out to Ambassador Matlock, who immediately agreed to give a talk and also recommended Nikolai Petro and Anatol Lieven to take place, and the IIP in Vienna agreed to host this event, and then also add our colleagues Olga Oliker and LUIZA BIALASIEWICZ. I'm sorry, I'm very sorry, Lisa. You will correct this immediately. And Heinz Gärtner, of course, also from the IIP in Vienna, and we want to discuss what kind of solutions there could be for Ukraine. So welcome to everybody. Let me just very briefly introduce the first three speakers. Ambassador Jack Matlock is a career diplomat who served on the front lines of American diplomacy during the Cold War. He was the director of Soviet affairs at the State Department and later ambassador to Czechoslovakia. And from 1987 to 1991, he was the US ambassador to the Soviet Union, witnessing the very end of that state in Europe. And since retiring from the Foreign Service, he has focused on understanding how the Cold War ended and how the lessons from that experience might be applied to public policy today. So he has also gained a reputation as a historian. toward the end of last year, he wrote that essay, which then started quite a controversy of people critical of these opinions, but also a lot of support, also coming from Anatol Lieven and Nikolai Petro, which brings me to the second speaker. Anatol Lieven is a British author, a policy analyst and professor at Georgetown University, and currently a visiting professor at King's College London.
Actually, sorry, I have to cut in. I'm no longer at Georgetown. I'm at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington.
I am very sorry. that has reached me only now. So at the Quincy Institute, he is, and he recently published a book actually on Ukraine and Russia, a fraternal rivalry, and wrote an essay in defense and in defense of Ambassador Matlock's assessment and on the situation in Ukraine. He has also recently published an article in which he argued for Ukrainian neutrality. Then the third speaker is going to be Nikolai Petro. He is professor of politics at the University of Rhode Island, where he teaches comparative and international politics. His focus is on the role that religious, historical, and cultural narratives play in democratic development, and his regional areas of expertise are Russia and Ukraine. He's the author of many books, among others, The Rebirth of Russian Democracy and Russian Foreign Policy. And with that said, I'll let the other three speakers be introduced by Stephanie. Stephanie, please. You're muted.
Thank you very much, Pascal. I'm very happy to welcome also Olga Oliker. She's Program Director of the International Crisis Group, responsible for Europe and Central Asia. She zoomed in from Brussels, so welcome. I would like to introduce, of course, also LUIZA BIALASIEWICZ. It's a difficult name. I hope I did it right. She's a political geographer and professor of European governance at the University of Amsterdam. And she's also a member of the advisory board of the IIP. And last but not least, of course, I would like to introduce Heinz Gärtner. He's professor of political sciences, and he's the chair of the advisory board of the IIP. And I look forward to your inputs after the first three speakers.
And thank you very much. With that, I would like to give the word to Ambassador Jack Matlock. Ambassador, you have about 7-8 minutes. Please let us know your viewpoint on how to restore peace in Ukraine.
Well, first of all, I think we need a better understanding of the historical background of some of these. And to say briefly, I believe that since the end of the Cold War, which I believe ended ideologically and definitively by 1989, that the policies of the United States and its allies in Europe have failed to take advantage of the end of the Cold War, when we produced a Europe whole and free. Since then, I think beginning in the late 90s, Western policies have tended to redivide Europe. And I think that is unfortunate. Now, the second point I would make is that there is a widespread belief, both in the West and in Russia, that the Cold War ended with a defeat for the Soviet Union. I consider that absolutely incorrect. The Cold War ended by negotiation to the benefit of the Soviet Union and of the United States and its Western allies. Everybody won. The second misperception is that the Cold War ended with the breakup of the Soviet Union. That too, I think, is incorrect. The Cold War had ended before the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the breakup of the Soviet Union was not a product of Western policy in the Cold War, but rather of internal politics within the Soviet Union. I would say the main person who led the breakup of the Soviet Union was the elected leader of the RSFSR, the Russian Soviet Federated Republic. And it started with essentially a conspiracy. Now, so people have in their idea that, well, we won the Cold War. Then they would say Russia was defeated, although it was the Soviet Union, it wasn't Russia. And the third, therefore, as Francis Fukuyama famously wrote, it was the end of history. It was proof that this sort of political system, which we call democracy, in the United States, Western Europe, and maybe a handful of others, was the future of mankind. And there also was the idea that somehow you can use, you had the power to change other countries. So there was also a total misperception of power. Of course, during the Cold War, we spoke of the two superpowers because two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, had enough nuclear weapons that if they were used, could not only wipe out the enemy, they would wipe out everybody. Therefore, their use, of course, is totally, not only unacceptable, totally ridiculous. Well, you know, as far as nuclear weapons, they're still two superpowers. But in speaking of terms like superpower, you ignore what power of what sort can do and cannot do. Now, military power cannot spread democracy or any other system of government. Military power cannot protect human rights, however we define them. And by the way, our definition keeps changing from one type or another. Now, in that context, I think it has been a tragedy that beginning in the late 90s, and one of the acts was the attack on Serbia without a declaration of war or agreement in the Security Council. I know there are humanitarian issues, but that was an illegal war. And of course, that plus the beginnings of expanding NATO when other countries, the countries in Eastern Europe, were not under any threat, something I argued strongly against. Then this began a process which inevitably would have brought about a redivision of Europe. Now, what does this all have to do with Ukraine? I would say we have to recognize that Ukraine, though in effect was handed independence in 1991 by the pressures of led by Boris Yeltsin, the Russian president. Its borders have been put together relatively recently, and the most important architect of its borders was Joseph Stalin. Unfortunately, it has not been able to develop a concerted, you might say, feeling of what it means to be Ukrainian. And those in the West who were most recently joined to the Soviet Union by Stalin have one definition of Ukraine, Ukrainian nationality. Others in the East, you have many who are Russian speaking, but consider themselves Ukrainians, but would like to keep their Russian identity. Now, so I think Ukraine's problems, and when you look at the elections that have taken place, it has been clear that Ukraine's current constitution does not accommodate the fact that the country has not yet developed a unified definition of what it means to be Ukrainian. And therefore, each of the elections were won by a very narrow majority, but with the West voting over 90% for one side, and the East up to 85, 90% from the other side. So that has been the problem, the fundamental problem. Now, I'll leave it to others to look at some of the results of this, but I would say that the policies of the West, based upon those misperceptions which I've already mentioned, that the Cold War ended with the defeat of the Soviet Union, that the breakup of the Soviet Union was a victory for the West, and that somehow this left the United States and its allies with the power to spread its, what we call democracy, to other countries using by whatever means necessary. There was also combined with this the idea that Russia should be sort of reduced in power. I think Zbigniew Brzezinski always looked at things in great power terms, as if we had learned nothing from 2 world wars in the 20th century. That somehow, but what became an internal problem in Ukraine, and one which I think will only be solved if the Ukrainians are willing to adopt a federal system which gives equal rights to other language groups, just as, say, in Finland, the Swedes, who are a minority, have full cultural rights. And one would wonder what would happen to Irish independence if they insisted you couldn't be a loyal Irishman unless you spoke Gaelic. So the idea that somehow the Russian language has no place in Ukraine is simply a self-defeating assumption that some make. Now, so that where does that leave us? I think that actually the involvement of the West in this divided nation, which nevertheless is geopolitically absolutely essential to Russia, not for Russia to dominate and rule, but at least to have as a non-enemy and hopefully a friend. I mean, just look at the map or look at the history. My own feeling is that the militarization, first of all, of a new division in Europe has been a big mistake. I think it is unnecessary. There's no reason for a new Cold War. There was a reason when the Soviet Union was a communist state dedicated to world revolution, as it was early on, but dropped by Gorbachev. So the idea of replicating and talking about a new Cold War makes it almost very difficult for us to deal with the real problems today, which are, well, we know epidemics, environmental degradation, terrorism, the mass displacement of peoples, these failed states. These are problems that are not going to be solved by competing over who controls what territory. So I would say that now, when we get into the precise present, I would say, first of all, the Ukrainians have to get their act together in a less than suicidal course in terms of their most powerful neighbor, and that in many ways, the less the US and the West interfere, particularly by encouraging militarization, the easier it's going to be for them to come to that conclusion. And just finally, on my part, we need to find a way to walk back from this idea that there is a struggle between East and West, or a struggle between, now the division is being between authoritarianism and so-called democracy. I'll tell you, every one of our countries has elements of authoritarianism. There might be degrees of it. There is no inconsistency between democracy and an authoritarian government if the people of a country feel threatened in one way or another. That's what produces authoritarianism. So the idea that this is the sort of ideological struggle we had during the Cold War is wrong. And I think basically we're going to have to come off these mistaken assumptions and begin to deal with the reality if we are to meet the challenges of the real issues that should unite us rather than dividing us.
Thank you very much, ambassadors, for these very powerful words of yours. Then I would like to give the word to Professor Anatol Lieven to please give us your view on the matter and on Ukraine, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It goes without saying I endorse everything that Ambassador Matlock has just said. Just a few thoughts to add to it. One is that I think that we in Europe, I'm British, but I suppose I can still consider myself an honorary European, make one fundamental conceptual mistake about Russia, I think, which is that since Russia is situated on the same continent as the European Union, we expect Russia to play by the internal rules of the European Union without, of course, being a member of the European Union or NATO. From Russia's point of view, of course, it has a complete right, as it sees it, to operate along the lines followed by other great powers in the world, led most notably by the United States. And of course, from the point of view of policy towards Ukraine, a point that many of us have made over and over again, the United States, for very nearly 200 years, has made the single most important and most continuous aspect of its external policy, the stated determination to exclude actual or potentially hostile military alliances led by actual or potentially hostile great powers from its immediate neighborhood in Central America and the Caribbean, the Monroe Doctrine. And as we have seen within our own lifetimes, or at least certainly mine, I'm getting a bit old, of course, the United States has been willing to act with extreme ruthlessness in Central America in defense of the Monroe Doctrine. So there is a problem here in mutual perceptions between Russia and Europe. In the case of America, I have to say, the attitude can more simply be summed up under the heading of hypocrisy. Now, concerning the specific issue of neutrality, a couple of points. The first is, of course, as with the Austrian State Treaty, as indeed with the Finnish treaty, the whole point about a treaty of neutrality is that it cuts both ways. In other words, it excludes Ukrainian membership of NATO. The European Union, I think, is an issue that one can defer, shall we say. But it also excludes a close alliance with Russia of the kind which, at least until 2014, was aimed at by the Russian government, membership of the Eurasian Union. That would also be excluded. And that, I think, is both the only, de facto, the only way to an agreement over Ukraine, but it is also a recognition of simple basic reality, as emphasized by what happened in 2014 and since, which is that trying to force Ukraine into a clear choice between Russia and the West, or Russia and America, it is disastrous. It is bound bitterly to divide Ukraine. And as we've seen, it will produce on one side or another rebellion against any such attempt. In 2013 to 2014, we saw rebellion against the attempt to take Ukraine into the Eurasian Union. But then, of course, when Ukraine lurched heavily towards the West, we saw, and towards Ukrainian ethnic nationalism, we saw revolt against this in eastern parts of the country. So neutrality corresponds both to international realities, but also to realities within Ukraine. I'm sure that Nikolai will have a lot more to say on this subject as one of the greatest experts on ethnic relations and identities within Ukraine. Although, well, I won't get into the difficulties of defining who is and who is not an ethnic Ukrainian or Russian in the east and south of the country, an extremely complicated issue. Now, the second point I think to make is that, paradoxically enough, as things stand, the debate about NATO membership for Ukraine is also, of course, completely empty, because Ukraine cannot get NATO membership, as long as the issues of Crimea and the Donbass remain unsettled, but secondly, of course, because NATO and the United States have made repeatedly clear that they will not fight to defend Ukraine. In other words, any offer of Article 5 guarantee to Ukraine would be totally empty, utterly false, and something that I think, I at least have pointed out repeatedly to people in NATO, far from in any way strengthening NATO, would actually severely, perhaps catastrophically undermine the image, the credibility of the Article 5 guarantee more generally for the existing members of NATO. But, of course, by the same token, as long as, from Russia's point of view, the threat of NATO membership remains, that is certainly a strong incentive to keep the issue of the Donbass open. Now, on that, however, there is a second way of approaching the issue of Ukrainian neutrality, if it is simply, whether you say for reasons of principle, whether you say for reasons of prestige, or whether you say because of the moral cowardice of our leaderships. If it is, in fact, impossible formally to abandon the principle of keeping the idea of NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine open, there is a way to that, to neutrality, as you might say, by the back door, and that is the Minsk II agreement on autonomy, full autonomy, guaranteed under international treaty for the Donbass within Ukraine. Because certainly, as the Ukrainian government and parliament majority have feared, which is one key reason why they have refused to implement Minsk II, autonomy for the Donbass within Ukraine would, in effect, act to block unilateral Ukrainian moves towards the West. It would act as an insurance policy for all those elements in Ukraine, which, as Ambassador Matlock has said, have been historically extremely strong. Very difficult today to say how strong, because just as opinion polls in the Donbass cannot, of course, be taken at face value. So, in the rest of Ukraine, we have seen a degree of state control, which also makes it very hard to assess what public opinion on these issues really is. But certainly, a peace settlement for the Donbass would, in my view, also address the basic issues that we are talking about. And of course, as long as the conflict in the Donbass remains open, there will be a permanent risk, even if we can get through the present crisis without a new war. There will be a permanent risk of a new war erupting. So Europe will live under this sword of Damocles, not of the West going to war with Russia, unless through some truly catastrophic succession of idiotic mistakes, but certainly a war with very damaging consequences for our continent. Now, finally, when it comes to Ukrainian democracy or democratization and moves towards a successful free market, something that we really have not seen in Ukraine so far. It is worth pointing out that Ukrainian GDP per capita is still only a third of Russia's, and this after 7 years of reforms that have been so trumpeted by the West, and of course fairly heavily supported as well. Now, the line that we have heard really since the beginning of NATO expansion, and EU as well, of course, is that it is only through membership of NATO and the European Union that successful democracy and economic reform can be guaranteed. I have to say that I see this very differently. Finland and Austria, of course, achieved tremendous success as free market liberal democracies without being members of either NATO or the European Union, and have not developed in any way further from that point of view since the end of the Cold War. On the other hand, of course, we have seen a number of melancholy cases by now in Eastern Europe among the former communist states where membership of NATO and the European Union has certainly not guaranteed successful democratic, or at least liberal democratic reform, or of course moves towards government honesty and real, successful anti-corruption measures. My view is that if a country is not capable of developing successfully as a free market democracy without being in NATO and the European Union, then it almost certainly is not going to develop successfully if it's in the EU and NATO. Turkey is not, of course, in the European Union, but it is in NATO, not perhaps one's ideal of a liberal democracy today. So I think that this is a false argument. Moreover, as long as the conflict with Russia remains, once again, I'm sure that Nikolai will have something to say about this, this will more or less ensure that forces in Kiev develop Ukraine or are dedicated to developing Ukraine and have success in this from an official point of view as a mono-ethnic, ethno-linguistic state. That, of course, guarantees permanent trouble, with the Russian and the Russian-speaking minorities. So, and also, of course, will act, or certainly should act, as a tremendous barrier to Ukraine's progress, towards Western liberal democracy. Of course, how long our own liberal democracies will last is another question, but it is another question, so I won't get into that. One last point, since I suppose spiritually we're all in Vienna today, wherever we may physically be around the world. I was brought up, I'm not that old, but nevertheless, as many of us perhaps with a historical sense, particularly if we have an East European or Central European background, very much in the shadow of what happened in 1914 and how the European great powers and great civilized powers destroyed each other and came damn close to destroying European civilization, starting in 1914, and then, of course, the consequences of that later. It's worth remembering that every one of those states went to war in the sincere conviction that it was fighting for, a version of superior civilization. We really don't see it that way 110 years on. And as Ambassador Matlock has said, given all the other threats hanging over us, including climate change. I really do not think that it is how our descendants will see us 110 years from now, if we do continue along our present path of confrontation and perhaps conflict with Russia. There was a British poem which went through all the countries of Europe: Germany, Austria, Russia, France, Britain, and it's a succession of ghosts of soldiers killed, and at the end of every verse there is the line, "I died for freedom, this I know, for those who bade me fight have told me so." Thank you.
Thank you very much for those poetic words. And let me just say that as this being organized in Austria and me being Swiss and also having a memory of this kind of historical memory, and knowing that in 1815 Switzerland too was neutralized, and for the Austrians then too in 1955, there just seems to be a lot of parallels, right, that are so obvious and striking that we thought that a lot of us here think that it might just be a solution to say this is not going to be anyone's land, as you pointed out. But on this note, we would like to know from Nikolai Petro how he sees the situation, if you would see as a neutral solution as a solution, or if you have another way that you would like us to look at the whole situation. Nikolai, please.
Thank you very much. I will be echoing some of the points already made, but add a few of my own, and I will be brief. From my perspective, there is, in addition to the conflict between Russia and the West over Ukraine, and the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, a conflict within Ukraine, which is primarily about who gets to define Ukrainian identity. For many in Western Ukraine, inspired by the historical example of Galicia, being Ukrainian means rejecting all things Russian: language, religion, trade, resources, science, music, books, everything. Only when Ukraine has thus decolonized itself will the true Ukraine be able to emerge. During the 2014 Maidan, this was referred to as making a civilizational choice. For many in Eastern or Malaros Ukraine, however, being Ukrainian means having a distinctive regional identity that still shares much with Russia. Most people in this Russophile half of Ukraine rejected the call for a civilizational choice as unnecessary, divisive, and demeaning. This conflict can be traced back at least 150 years. Some would say longer. During that period, it has led to armed conflict within Ukraine 3 times: during World War I, during World War II, and after the 2014 Maidan. Since 1991, however, it has also led to sporadic violence over the course of the last 3 decades in Donbass, Crimea, Galicia, and Transcarpathia. The obvious solution is federalism. Many Ukrainian politicians understand this. Federalism was proposed during the latter half of the 19th century by the founding fathers of the Ukrainian national movement. Then again, when Ukrainian statehood was first declared in 1917. Then again, in the early 1990s, by the leader of the Ruch movement, Vyacheslav Chornovil. But it was always opposed by militant Galician nationalists who feared that the East would then secede and leave them with a much smaller nation. In today's Ukraine, advocating federalism is tantamount to treason. But the problem of what to do with Russophile Ukraine in a nationalistic Ukrainian state remains. It became acute again in 2014 when many in the East saw in the Maidan an effort by Galician Ukraine to exclude them from the country's political life entirely. I conclude, therefore, that the crisis inside Ukraine cannot be solved by external intervention, but only by a process of dialogue healing, and reconciliation that must begin by acknowledging that the vast majority of Ukrainians are bicultural and that rejects efforts to create a Ukrainian nation without its Russophile citizens. The second Minsk Accords start from this premise and seek, in fact, to enshrine the principle of cultural autonomy in the Ukrainian constitution. That is why they have such wide support in Donbass and so little support in Western Ukraine. Kiev, as former Foreign Minister Pavlo Klimkin now acknowledges, never intended to fulfill these agreements because they were seen as a backdoor to federalism. Instead of Minsk's amnesty and constitutional provisions for local autonomy, therefore, the Ukrainian parliament has in recent years passed laws on reintegration which stipulate that after the liberation of Donbass, its population will have to endure limited civil rights for the next 20 to 25 years. This has evoked little comment in the West, but I fear that it will create future generations in Donbass resentful at constantly being reminded that they are not considered true Ukrainians. Foreign policy neutrality cannot solve this problem. At best, it can lessen the global tensions that are being provoked by efforts to make Ukraine part of this or that sphere of influence. This is no small thing, to be sure, but it does not even begin to address the problem of intolerance, which the murdered journalist and writer Olga Oliker described so graphically in 2010. Quote, "Our debates," he meant within Ukraine, "are not between the government and Her Majesty's opposition, not between two schools of a respected science, but between two different countries, as if a contemporary evolutionary biologist could have a discussion with an inquisitor from the Middle Ages. At best, they will simply choose to ignore each other. At worst, one of them will smash the other's skull without, by the way, having proved anything to his opponent." The conflict over Ukraine, in other words, is distinct from the conflict within Ukraine. Resolving the conflict over Ukraine will not resolve the conflict within, whereas resolving the conflict within will resolve the conflict over Ukraine. That sort of healing can begin when the Ukrainian government stops denying that there is any domestic aspect to this conflict and embraces dialogue with its Russophile citizens, perhaps in the form of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that would allow former enemies to become true stakeholders in a new and more inclusive Ukrainian society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikolai, for your words. I'll pass the moderation now to Stephanie.
Thank you very much. I would like to continue with Olga, and I think you already heard a lot of things on which you would like to comment, but I would also like to draw the attention still on the situation right now, because I mean the situation is dangerous. I mean, at least it is portrayed as quite dangerous. There is 100,000 troops it's not only on the eastern flank, it's also in the north and also in the south on Crimea, which has been, and I think we all can agree upon that, annexed illegally by Russia in 2014. And I think this is also, even though we talk about what is going on within Ukraine, the events in 2014, of course, also shaped the course of Ukrainians also within the country. And I think this is also quite logical if you look at, for example, of how the support towards NATO enlargement was before 2014 and how it changed afterwards. And I think there has been quite a shift. So I do not want to take any much time from your intervention, but please feel free on how do you assess the situation right now? How big is the danger? Is there possible to find a solution between, in this context, I mean, again, then USA and Russia, considering that the demands of Russia from the beginning have been, I would say, quite strong and even been considered as non-starters from the Western point of view. But please, Olga, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Pascal, and thank you for the International Institute of Peace for convening this conversation and for inviting me to take part in it. So, just to echo Stephanie's introduction, I think as I go, I will respond to some of the things other panelists have said. But, it is useful to point out that Ukraine is at war. A war continues on its territory. And that what we've seen over the last year is a series of events that have put lie to assumptions I think a lot of us made previously, that despite the war, everybody was, if not happy, then willing to live with the new status quo of a continuing war. Russia, because it kept Ukraine off balance, Ukraine, because it kept the West on its side. But what we've learned over the past year is that Russia wasn't so happy, right? So we saw a troop buildup in the spring of last year, which was partially reversed. They kept the infrastructure, moved some of the forces back. And then another troop buildup that began this fall and continues to this day. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that Russia hasn't made any new threats to Ukraine, except those exemplified by putting a whole lot of forces near Ukrainian territory. And that Russia's buildup has led to talks with Western states, which aren't simply about Ukraine, they're about European security in general, because Ukraine, although it certainly matters as Ukraine, matters far more to both Russia and Western states because of its implications for European security. And Russia, as Stephanie just noted, Russia put forward these two draft treaties, one for the United States, one for NATO, which demanded legally binding commitments that NATO would not enlarge, among other places, to Ukraine, that NATO forces would pull back from the territories of states that had not been allies prior to the first wave of expansion, which is to say to basically where they were before 1997, that no shorter intermediate range missiles be deployed in Europe. That one's a little more reasonable. But yeah, I mean, a series of kind of demands, which got everyone talking, right? So it's not a terrible thing if you make fairly expansive demands if they get everyone talking, but then the talks didn't seem to go that well. Now, what's interesting in the talks is that the counter proposals that came back from the United States and NATO were focused on conventional arms control. We're focused on an assumption that you have an international situation where you've got a standoff. It's going to be a standoff for a while. You need to manage it, to put in things in place that will manage the escalation, right? We're not looking to solve, we're looking to manage. And, you know, I think there are actually some fairly reasonable ideas, but what we've got right now coming out of these meetings is a sense that the Russians want to talk to the Americans because that's where they think the decisions are made and the deals can be delivered. They're not entirely wrong on that. They're not entirely right on that, in that the Americans do need allies and friends in order to move forward anything. And Moscow says it's waiting for written responses from the United States and don't particularly want to talk to NATO. So let me talk you through, and this actually is also partially response to one of the questions that was asked by Elena Yermakova on, you know, is an invasion possible? Is further escalation possible? So here's my story on why it is quite plausible that Russia may escalate in Ukraine. And that is because it has a lot of reasons to and not a lot of reasons not to. It wants deals on Ukraine. I mean, it wants a Ukraine that is its vassal, really, and it wants deals on European security. These are intertwined, but they are also separate. It has laid out what kind of a deal it wants on European security. And while what it got back strike me as very reasonable proposals, those aren't what Moscow wanted. Now, Russia may very well be thinking that a bit or a lot of military escalation could get everyone to come to their senses. Make them realize that Western states won't come in to save Ukraine, and that everybody needs to cut a deal on Russia's terms or closer to them. It may also be thinking that Western deterrence threats, those of more military buildups, more sanctions, those are all things that are happening anyway from Russia's perspective. So it doesn't matter what they do. If you're going to get more sanctions and more of a buildup in the East, no matter what you do, okay, you're threatening me with things that are already happening. Okay, that's not really all that scary. And I think the inherent threat that escalation in Ukraine will hurt because of the Ukrainians pushing back, I think Moscow's planners largely discount, because in my view, they underestimate Ukrainian military capacity, and they certainly underestimate Ukrainian will. So pushing back a little bit at something Nikolai said, look, the Russians do assume that the Russophonic population is Russophilic. This is not actually the same thing. You can speak Russian and not be pro-Russian. I speak Russian. I'm not pro-Russian. It's my first language. That doesn't make me pro-Russian. And I think this is one of the challenges. Also, I would point out that nobody has done as much for Ukrainian nationalism, possibly in the last 100 years, as Vladimir Putin has. Right? I mean, to unify Ukrainians as Ukrainians for all the things that continue to divide them, for all the disagreements about what it means to be Ukrainian. I'm American. There are lots of disagreements on what it means to be American too. But nothing has made them feel as much like, all that aside, we are Ukrainian, as this war. And public opinion polls do support that. And I disagree with Anatol. I do think you can carry out academically solid public opinion polling in government-controlled Ukraine. A lot of my friends do it. So what are our options to prevent war if we are the West, which, you know, is the only position I can speak from? I mean, I will also note we've got a panel here, people talking about Ukraine. As far as I know, none of us are Ukrainian. I mean, my grandmother's from Zhytomyr, but you know, she left Zhytomyr for Petersburg in the 1920s. So, you know, I don't claim to be Ukrainian. So what can we do? So one option, threaten escalation to frighten the Russians. But as Anatol has said, NATO member states won't fight. They've made that very clear. And the continuing threat that there's going to be more buildups is something Russia expects anyway. Give Russia what it wants. But the fear in NATO and among many of its members and among neighbors between NATO and Europe is that this is going to undermine their own security. And certainly agreeing to the promises of military rollback that Russia wants will make these countries feel extremely insecure. While pledges that Ukraine will never join NATO, look, Ukraine is not on track to join NATO. Everybody agrees with this. Promises of never are very uncomfortable for any alliance to make. This is not because NATO wants to invite the Ukrainians in, it's because it's been very clear that any alliance enlargement is up to present members and prospective states and no one else. And then the third option, we just keep talking to see if a solution can be found that meets everyone's needs, at least for the near term, to kick the ball down the road until the next crisis. So is neutrality for Ukraine part of that solution? And sadly, I don't think it is, not because it's inherently a terrible idea, but because it's only workable after you've got a solution, not as a solution in the near term, right? You might get there eventually, you're not going to get there in order to solve this problem. Why? Well, it's been tried before and it hasn't stuck, right? You used to have a Ukrainian constitution that committed to non-block status. And as the I think all of us know, we've had a lot of back and forth within Ukraine itself on what just how aligned with NATO Ukraine would or would not be. And Heinz and Yannick have a very nice paper that goes through some of this back and forth in these documents. Also, the foreign promises of security that come with neutrality were also tried in a fairly weak way with the Budapest Memorandum, right? They were security assurances, not guarantees, and that was for a very good reason, which was nobody wanted to offer guarantees. But again, once something has fallen apart, even something that's comparatively weak, it's really hard to convince people that you've got real guarantees in the works that they're going to believe in and that they're going to trust. Third, Ukraine has been invaded recently by the country that it's supposed to, be neutral next to. It's a tough ask to tell somebody that, yeah, okay, now they just invaded you, but you shouldn't look for protection against them. You should just kind of find a nice middle path. That has, as I think I already said, erased some of the ambivalence that was very much a very big part of the Ukrainian polity when it came to the way that Ukrainians looked at the West and at Russia. It has made Russia into much more of a threat. And you're seeing this with that opinion polling, which I do trust, and you're seeing it shift and become stronger and stronger each year. So Ukrainians know they're not going to get NATO membership, right? They're not dumb and they're not unable to read the tea leaves. What they've settled for in this very difficult situation is a sort of aspirational alignment, right? Where they don't get any guarantees, but they do say, we want to be part of the West. This is where we want to be. And hey, if you guys could help us out as much as possible, and see if you can frighten the Russians enough that they don't do us too much more damage, we'd appreciate that. And it's not a comfortable position, and it's not a secure position. They feel safer with that, though, than I think they would feel with Russian promises. Fourth reason that neutrality is problematic in the near term is that Western states don't care that much about Ukraine, to be honest, but they also very much don't want to give up and back away. And there's no way that they, Ukraine and Russia, wouldn't see any kind of real pressure on Ukraine to accept neutrality as anything other than capitulation. So, you know, the Russians may actually, if the Russians are right that a war would prove to everybody that they take this all more seriously than they do, then maybe that is how you could get to some kind of capitulation. But it's very hard to imagine that happening short of that. And I think, you know, I think this is a real problem. So over time, yes, neutrality may be a goal, but we're not there. What we need to do in the meantime is our best to find solutions that can be nested in a broader European security arrangements with all of those arms control limits, including, I would note, in the Baltic Sea, where agreeing to disagree on Crimea, I think, would be a really important step forward. Commitments not to station forces on non-allied territory on the part of everybody, toning down the rhetoric on enlargement without backing away from enlargement, which I just don't think is plausible in the near term, but then recognizing that it might not work. And we may find ourselves all talking again after there has been more escalation, which is not a terribly cheering thought, but it's all I've got. It's where I come down. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Olga. I think it was very complimentary also to what others have been saying. And LUIZA, what you heard until now, I mean, you as a political geographer, and I mean, we have been talking in recent years again about the return of geopolitics, and now we have like this stalemate between, like, again, the East and the West. How would you assess the role of Russia, but also the European Union? We haven't been talking a lot about the European Union so far, but we know that, for example, I mean, Ukraine is bordering. I mean, even the Western part used part of historical Hungarian Austrian Empire, etc. So from your point of view, what would you like to add to the discussion?
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you also for organizing this talk. And yes, I guess from my political geographer perspective, I'd be very happy to say something about how the broader geopolitics of the Ukraine question is being staged, because I think it's a very important point that already has been raised. So who are the players that matter here? What is the script? And I would, in fact, like to say something about the role played, or rather not played, by the EU, and I guess echoing in part what Olga just said about placing this question in a broader European security architecture. So I guess the first point that I would like to raise regards some very troubling assumptions of most analyses of what should be done, because already the specification of possible solutions determines who will be the players in the game. And what we have seen in the past months, in fact, is an entirely uncritical full-scale adoption of the language of classical geopolitics. So hard power, military might, territorial control, invoking, in fact, a new Cold War, as Ambassador Matlock noted in his opening comments. And here I'm not speaking just about the language used by Russia. The fact that not only just US, but also European commentators, including reputable think tanks, have been repeating over the past weeks that diplomacy is absolutely useless unless backed by hard power, this is very troubling to my mind. So when leading European think tanks publish commentaries noting that to counter a power willing to use military might, only military might will do, and by the way, Turkey was cited, so I'll bring this up, cite Erdogan as a successful model of standing up to Putin, we have a problem. And it is a problem because it immediately sidelines any solution that is not military, or at least based in security and defense structures. So the EU in this imaginary becomes immediately reduced to NATO, and any alternative geopolitical solutions or security architectures are immediately precluded. And that's in fact what has been happening in the past months. as you will all be aware, the EU's High Representative was not present in Geneva, nor in Brussels, where the dialogue was taking place between Russia, the US, and NATO. And I think it's very easy, as we usually do, to blame the EU for the state of affairs. So, kind of invoking the usual commonplaces of, lack of a common European geopolitical vision, the unwillingness by Europe to take great power decisions, disunity among member states, and these accusations of Europe's supposed geopolitical weakness are not new. And they are in part correct. So the lack of a common position on Russia is and has long been a problem that has in fact been ably exploited by Putin. I mean, I'm just thinking most recently, the incident of Lavrov approaching the German and French foreign ministers directly in the autumn, to kind of restart discussions within the Normandy format, but we could cite numerous other instances. The lack of consensus among EU member states on what to do with Nord Stream 2 is also indicative. And, halting this project is certainly one very real non-military weapon that the Union could use. And it's interesting because Josep Borrell in the past few days had begun saying quite explicitly that this is something that should be considered, in fact, contradicting other EU leaders, including German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. But I want to return to how the discussions, and I don't mean just the actual discussions that have been taking place between Russia, the US, and NATO, but also the kind of the wider discussions taking place in the media and the policy community. So how these discussions have already, in a sense, framed in seemingly inevitable fashion, both the realm of possibility of what can be done, and the option of neutrality that we are discussing simply doesn't enter into it. And in this sense, I would agree with Olga. I mean, but there are other things that are precluded as well. And Nikolai was mentioning, kind of the anathema of talking about a federal solution. I mean, that is also completely absent. So it's not only the options, the realm of possibility that has been defined in these discussions, but also the players who matter. So who has the right to speak and make these decisions. When Borrell traveled to eastern Ukraine last week, he pronounced, kind of grandly that we are no longer in Yalta times, and, we cannot think that great powers will be deciding the fate of others. And the comment that he made was that, quote, any discussion regarding European security must also include the European Union and Ukraine. Now, unfortunately, his words were lovely words, but have so far fallen into a vacuum. Because not only neither the EU nor mostly Ukraine have been present at the talks, but what is more, in these discussions, both the EU and Ukraine have been reduced to singular geopolitical caricatures of themselves. The EU has been reduced to NATO. And so when we have Jens Stoltenberg saying of the exclusion of the EU in Brussels, that it's not a problem because, as he said, European allies are at the table because European allies are in NATO. I mean, saying this, we have a direct depotentiation of the role of the EU, of the role of the High Representative, stripped of any right to speak for Europe. But we also preclude any solution that does not pass through NATO, enlarged NATO or not. Ukraine, on the other hand, is reduced to what those who claim to be speaking for Ukraine say it is. And I don't mean here Ukrainian politicians, but Russian, American, or European politicians speaking for Ukraine. And here, so what Ukraine supposedly is in terms of its security desiderata, its relationship to Europe, to Russia, but also any kind of imaginaries of its internal politics. Kind of again echoing what Nikolai said. And as much as it has become very fashionable to repeat that Ukraine must be sovereign in deciding its own fate, I think every European politician has said this. Ukrainian voices, or a diversity of Ukrainian voices, have been mostly absent from these international discussions about the country's fate. And what has been largely absent is the recognition, confirmed by numerous studies by now, including by colleagues present here with us today. And I see Gertrude, who's done work on this with another colleague, John O'Loughlin, that there is no singular desire in Ukraine for the solutions proposed by either side. And here again, I will be echoing what Nikolai said, and I think this is very important to keep in mind when we're looking at this, kind of broader set of geopolitical representations, and again, who are the actors in the game and what they want. And I wanted to cite here a piece that many of you will have probably seen, published a couple of weeks ago by Ukrainian political scientist Vladishchenko, who noted that not only Ukraine is playing a secondary role in these discussions and in these negotiations about its destiny, but as he said, in a typically colonial way, commentators are homogenizing Ukrainians and misrecognizing the political diversity of a nation of over 40 million people. So the problem is not just deciding without Ukraine, appeals, to Ukraine's sovereign right to decide aside, but also deciding for a very diverse Ukraine as if they held identical opinions. Now, kind of thinking back to many studies, and and Olga, you were noting this as well, that yes, there are quite a few field studies and opinion polls. In December 2007, so on the eve of the famous Bucharest summit, less than 20% of Ukrainian citizens supported joining NATO. As a result of the annexation of Crimea, the start of the war in Donbass, that figure has gone up to about 40%. But that 40% has not only, kind of gotten to 40% because, some previously skeptical Ukrainians started to see NATO as somehow a protection against further hostile actions from Russia. And this is the point that Ishchenko makes. But what is important in looking at that 40% is that those surveys do not, most of them, include the most pro-Russian Ukrainian citizens from the territories that are no longer under Ukrainian government control. And again, aside from what you're saying, Olga, that it is possible, to do surveys in those territories. The main point here is that, when we are speaking for Ukraine, the voices of many Ukrainians are simply not accounted for. Now, it's very likely that Russia's actions have raised that percentage today. But what I would want to close with is that focusing the entire issue on the question of NATO membership is mistaken, because asking that question reduces the very realm of geopolitical possibility to a black and white choice between NATO and Russia with no other options possible, just as it reduces who we claim to be speaking for. And I will end my comments.
Thank you very much, Louisa. I think you also added some very interesting points, and we see how complex the whole situation is. And I think it is also very important, Olga addressed it as well. We are talking about a peaceful solution today for Ukraine without actually speaking with Ukrainians even still here. Let me just know we have been discussing this before, and we're also planning to work together with Ukrainians on this issue as well. Before I go next to Heinz, Nikolai just very briefly asked me, he wants a clarified question for Olga, very briefly, just before we then go on, then I guess more into the topic of neutrality. Please, Nikolai, very shortly.
Yes, thank you. I like more of a back and forth so that we can understand what it is we're actually agreeing about and the things that we do disagree about. So I chose the term Russophile rather than Russophone advisedly. And I'd like to ask Olga specifically what percentage of the population in Ukraine today she considers Russophile. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't have statistical data on this in front of me. I think there are folks on this call who might be able to answer this better than I and with data at their disposal. My understanding from looking at this material in the course of my own work is that, generally speaking, affinity towards Russia and fondness for Russia as an ally, as a friendly power, et cetera, has, used to be kind of at a 50-50 mark, and it's been declining for understandable reasons. Yes, in government-controlled Ukraine, where you're doing the polling over the course of the last 8 years. I will also say from my own interactions with people, including people who are non-government controlled Ukraine, that is also true, and even in non-government controlled Ukraine, there is a growing frustration with Russia. So, when you say Russophilic, you have to also define what it is you mean, right? And I don't want to derail this on this, but Rusophilic, does it mean you are really, really fond of the works of Lyudmila Petrushevskaya and Russian film? Does it mean that you want to join the Collective Security Treaty Organization? Does it mean you want to be part of the Eurasian Economic Union? So, I'm not sure that I took Rusophilic to mean in your presentation as people who wanted alignment, whether it's military or economic or sociocultural with Russia, but perhaps you meant something else, but then,
Thank you very much, Olga, for the clarification.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's move to our last speaker. I mean, we still have some time and we might prolong some extra minutes because it's so many speakers. But Heinz, after what you have been hearing so far, I mean, neutrality has been mentioned, and I'm pretty sure that this is also the topic you would like to speak about. But as you know, it's very contested when it comes to Ukraine. And I would also already like to bring in a question from Thomas Ainozzi, where he actually states that neutral states tend to be small and espouse neutrality on their free will. And if these preconditions are they not making it unlikely that Ukraine will decide to become neutral? So maybe you can already reflect on your remarks on the question from Thomas. And please, what is your solution for a peaceful solution for Ukraine?
Thank you, Stephanie. And I want to thank PASCAL Lotta. So he was the father of this webinar. He had this idea, but also I want to thank the IAB, of course, to give the organizational support. I will address the question by Thomas a little bit later. Ever since the Georgian crisis in 2008, I was considering whether neutrality would be an option for the East Central European states, and especially after the Ukraine crisis in 2014. So, and I'm looking at the Austrian model, whether it could be applied to the so-called in-between states. The in-between states, this is a term used by the OSCE report of 2015 back to diplomacy, the Ischinger report. And I have to say they didn't invent the term in-between, somebody else did, but I will come back to it later. In order to make this analogy, Austria and the in-between states comparable, I will use the context of polarization. And polarization, of course, comes in different shapes and forms in different periods. And the Cold War and the bipolarity was mentioned. We had these two Cold War alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But the neutral states at that time were the exception. They were the anomaly of the bloc system. So they stayed out of the bloc system already. Nevertheless, I have to say they played a very useful role in mediating between the big powers and the alliances, especially when we look at the CSE process. After the bipolarity, we have this academic concept mapped out by Charles Krautheimer about this unipolar moment. And in the unipolar moment, NATO endured, NATO stayed on, Warsaw Pact Treaty disappeared. There's lots of discussion why NATO did not demise and the Warsaw Pact did. So that's not the topic of today. But I also have to say this unipolar moment was not very peaceful at all. And then realists came out with this multipolarity. And looking at history, we know multipolarity was not a very peaceful concept as well. 1914 already was mentioned. Other versions of this multipolarity, so the post-American world or the rise of the rest. So, but polarization and polarity always comes with two features. One feature is the idealist underpinning. So we know it from the Cold War. We had this democracies and market economies against communist and planned economies. But also now you have this idea, at least in the academic world, about this democratic hegemony. So, and it comes also in different versions. Robert Kagan says, okay, democratic hegemony can only be achieved by the American leadership. And then we have John Erkenberry, who is saying, no, the democratic hegemony is already possible and then can prevail if there is a possible American decline. The second feature is alliance building. In polarization, there is accompanied always with alliances and new alliances, existing alliances. And case in point for the combination between these two features, the idealist and the alliance feature, is Joseph Biden's alliance of democracies. Here you have both, but I have to say it has an hypocritical aspect, because if necessary, the US always allies with authoritarian states as well. So geopolitics always trumps idealism. We have now this existing alliances. We have NATO, as I mentioned, but we also have the CSTO. It has been mentioned by Olga already as well. It has become recently prominent because of the Kazakhstan case, the collective security treaty. But we have new alliances emerging. We have this AUKUS and the Quad in Asia. We have the Abraham Accords in the Middle East. So we have we are in a situation of polarization and alliance building, but where does it leave small states? Where does it leave small states? What do small states do in this configuration of polarization? Small states only have two choices. They have two choices. One choice is bandwagon with a big power and join an alliance. The second choice is neutrality. The second choice is neutrality, staying out of great power conflict, avoiding of being entrapped in a big power conflict. So when this polarization is applied to the situation in the 50s, not, I have to say, also realists add a third option. They say bandwagoning and neutrality, and one other option would be balancing. But balancing is not really an option for small states because they don't make much of a difference. And if you talk about balancing, it's in many ways a euphemism of bandwagoning. So small states, what options do they have? In the 50s, looking into the Austrian example, neutrality, Austria was already entrapped in a big power conflict. So the solution for Austria was the option of neutrality. So Austria was occupied by big powers, it was divided, and when it opted for neutrality, it got its territorial integrity and sovereignty back. The troops of the foreign powers, including the Soviet Union, would leave. Accompanied to this neutrality, neutrality law, and I have to say it's based on international law, and that's what is the difference, what Olga mentions, what is different to the Budapest Memorandum and the self-declared neutrality of Ukraine before 2014. So it was not based on international law. So as Austrian neutrality was much stronger. So, and accompanied with this neutrality law was a state treaty where Austria was prohibited to join Germany. It means to join a big neighbor. So using the analogy, for example, for Ukraine, the big neighbor Germany could easily be exchanged with Russia. We call this Anschlussverbot. Germany went a different path, as we know. So it was divided, remained divided. However, when Austria became neutral, Austria was a model for German unification again in the 50s. So several thinkers and pundits used Austria as a suggestion for Germany, but not only for Germany. The most prominent one was George Kennan. George Kennan suggested a neutral Central European zone. George Kennan, he was the one who coined the term "in between states." Actually, he said states in between. So it was not the OSCE who really invented it. But George Kennan was joined by other prominent figures. The leader of the British Labour Party, Hugh Gaitskell, had a similar suggestion. There was an American bipartisan initiative by the Senators Humphrey and Noland, who had a similar suggestion of this neutral Central European zone. And the most well-known is the Rapatsky Plan of 57, and the Polish Foreign Minister suggested or linked this disengagement neutral zone with a nuclear weapon-free zone. It didn't work out, we know. One reason was Konrad Adenauer. Konrad Adenauer fiercely opposed neutrality of Germany. So he said it was a put to sleep tactic and poisoned by the Soviet Union, which was not true. If you look at Finland and Austria, they didn't end up in the Soviet bloc. So it was not really a Soviet strategy. So it basically Germany remained divided. So if we apply this now, this polarization to the in-between states, what we have now, so we have this in-between states between Russia and NATO, and on some of them we have Russian troops deployed, but also Russian-supported militias, like in Ukraine. So looking at this analogy of Austria and Germany, basically they have only two choices. They have two choices. They can join an alliance and bandwagon with a big state, meaning becoming NATO member, but that implies that they remain divided, because the Russians might stay, Russian militias, even the Russians might send in official troops as well to Donbass. So bandwagoning and alliance membership would be one choice, and the second choice is neutrality. So neutrality would the possibility for Ukraine to get its territorial integrity and sovereignty back, as Austria did in 55. So they have the choice between the German path and the Austrian path. They have the choice between permanent division or permanent neutrality. Now the question of Thomas, of course, Austrian neutrality was adopted by the Austrian parliament. It was a domestic decision, but of course in Ukraine there has to be a domestic, it has been linked to a domestic decision as well. If they want to be neutral and get its territorial integrity back, so that would be up to the Ukraine government. But I have to say, it took 10 years for Austria to come to this decision as well for neutrality, because in 54, 55, before the Austrian parliament adopted the permanent neutrality, basically no one in Austria supported neutrality anymore, no party anymore. It was only the conservative Chancellor Raab who went to Moscow and negotiated with the right Soviet faction to negotiate neutrality. It could have turned out very differently, and Austria would have been remained occupied and divided as Germany was.
Thank you very much, Heinz, for also enlightening us a little bit also on this neutrality concept, like based on international law, and how difficult it is also then to include and to convince the people. I would say we still have around 15 up to 20 minutes left for discussion, because it took us a little bit longer as I was expecting with such a huge panel. But maybe Pascal, you just hop in and pose the first question. I think there is one for Ambassador Matlock, which came in already a while ago, and then I'll see and just jump in as well.
Yes, so thank you very much for everybody giving us your insights. We have a lot of things happening already in the chat. And maybe let me ask this question that came in at the beginning. to Ambassador Matlock and Dr. Lieven. It's a bit of a long question, but I will read it out loud. Leading strategic expert of the Russian International Affairs Council, Andrei Korunov, in a recent interview with Executive Intelligence Review, where he soberly viewed the conflicts in the world, stated that he believed that Afghanistan was one of the few areas in the world where he sees no major contradictions between East and West, and where there is an opportunity for multilateral cooperation. Relevant portions of the interview with Mr. Kortunov are below among the link to the full interview. Do you agree that this is possible and desirable, and that cooperative action to stop the unfolding unprecedented humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan could have a positive spillover effect into red line situations such as Ukraine and Taiwan, and begin to shift the failed underlying assumption identified by Ambassador Matlock?
Well, I think any effort to cooperate to create, fulfill, you might say, the interests of both countries is useful. And that's precisely how we engineered our way out of the Cold War to begin with. Because what we did was to try to quietly find areas where our interests were in common and we could cooperate. And within about 3 years from the high tension that was there in 1983 and 84, by 1988 and 89, we were already ending the Cold War because we were cooperating in more and more areas instead of sort of competing in areas where neither could win. So yes, that, and I think also if there is a commitment to do more to combat cybercrime, which is going to be a big issue, that could be very important. There are other very clear common issues which we can deal with. And in fact, the Biden administration has said we want to continue negotiations about strategic stability and the other things. So there are a lot of things out there that can do this. But I would like to also make one point about Ukraine specifically. We have seen in this debate how so many issues really generate a lot of emotion. Now, I think that one of them is that somehow the decision over NATO membership or the possibility of having it can contribute to, you might say, the democratization and the economic improvement of Ukraine. That is a misconception, because what will in effect make the matter even worse is continuing to militarize these issues. I'll take the time to simply remind people, I was the American ambassador in Moscow when the 3 Baltic countries began to develop their desire for independence. They would come to me for consultations beginning in 1989, beginning with the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians, and they would describe their aspirations. And then they would say, inasmuch as you do not recognize legally our incorporation in the Soviet Union, when we declare independence, of course you'll recognize us. And I said, no. And there was a shock. They said, what do you mean? I said, no, for 2 reasons. One, the formal reason, we recognize countries that declare their independence if they in fact control the territory that they claim. You don't control that territory yet. But I said the real reason is, if we were to recognize your Declaration of Independence, that would bring about a Soviet repression. And it's something we can do nothing to protect you. Keep it peaceful, keep it within the, because if this goes violent for any reason, we cannot help you. Now, this is the situation also in Ukraine. And the idea somehow, if they were in NATO, that would help them solve their problems with Russia is absurd. It would exacerbate those problems. There are, now, several people have asked, do you really think Russian invasion is possible? It is hard for me to believe that a person as smart as President Putin is would actually invade Ukraine in force, because this would create so many problems for them, almost least of all the sanctions from the United States, which I think is not achieving anything in this respect. But if they were to, of course, they would win. There's no question about that. And they would, they would have maybe some guerrilla warfare here and there. I think they could be in Kiev. I'm not a military expert. I think they could be occupying Kiev in less than a week. So, I mean, let's be realistic. And now others have said, oh, well, if they're in NATO, they will have Article 5 guarantees. Does Article 5 guarantee that the United States would come to the military assistance of one invaded? No. Read the treaty. It says that if one is attacked, if a member is attacked, it will be considered an attack on all, and that the governments, and here I'm paraphrasing, will consider how to respond. It is not an automatic, we're going to fight. Have that in mind. And people who think that somehow that's going to be a solution to the problems that Georgia or Ukraine has are simply being deluded. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Anatol Lieven, the question also went to you.
I must say, I'm so sorry. I have to leave in about 5 minutes because I hadn't realized it would go on so long. Yes, I mean, look to, well, two things. First, let's say I can't do this because I have to go, but it would be very good to have a deeper discussion of the issue of the peace settlement for the Donbass based on the Minsk II agreement, which after all was drawn up by the French and Germans and endorsed by the United States and the United Nations. But we have really done nothing since then actually to bring about its implementation. Now, of course, there are big problems on the Russian side as well, but one must say clearly that the Ukrainian side has failed to issue the guarantees for Donbass autonomy, which are laid down and which obviously are the central and inescapable basis for any peace settlement there. Yeah, I mean, what is wrong with federalism? Democratic federalism. Germany has it, America has it, and so on and so forth. Is this one way out of the present impasse? But the other point I think we do need to come back to is I do think that all of us need to concentrate very heavily on the avoidance of war. Now, obviously, that involves pressure on Russia, certainly the threat of sanctions. But we do need to depart from a variety of facts that war would be disastrous. It would be disastrous in the first instance, of course, for Ukraine itself and the people, the ordinary people who would be in the way of that war. But obviously, it would have much wider international repercussions. But also, I mean, to sum up the present Western position very unsympathetically, we are too physically cowardly to fight for Ukraine, and we are too morally cowardly to make the sacrifices of prestige and our empty formal positions necessary to reach a peace settlement over Ukraine. Now, you can talk as much as you like about our great, democratic principles and so forth. I do not think that that is a morally admirable position.
Thank you.
Maybe if I hop in with another question, and Anatol, if you need to leave, I would say thank you very much from our side for joining us today, and I hope we'll see each other in the future. But since you also mentioned it, I would like just to stick to the topic about what is happening in the Donbas region. And there is a question in the chat about the Minsk agreements. And Fred Tanner, nice to see you, Fred, also is asking, the Minsk agreements, they actually provide a separatist republic in the Donbas with a special status for the so-called non-governmental controlled areas. So his question is, on what grounds would this special status reflect a federal solution as opposed to decentralization? And from where would the separatist republics draw the authority for a droit de regard or even a veto power on Kiev foreign policy issues? Who would like to address that?
There would be no formal veto on Ukrainian foreign policy, but obviously the reincorporation of a major Russian-speaking area, which certainly in the past has been extremely hostile to NATO membership, would act as a considerable de facto block on that. But the issue of autonomy for the Donbass, once again, look, opinion polls are, I have to repeat, I think unreliable. But certainly until 2014, opinion polls showed very strong support within the Donbass for autonomous status within Ukraine, as by the way they did in Crimea as well. But I think most importantly, agreements on local autonomy as a solution to ethnic conflicts are very much, have been part of the West's playbook, sometimes successful, sometimes unsuccessful, but certainly a standard part of our approach to seeking peace settlements in the case of such conflicts. And I don't see why, in terms of principle at least, there is any objection to this solution for the Donbass conflict, especially given that the only, and I mean the only, alternative solution is Russian military victory. The Ukrainians are not going to reconquer it, that's for sure. So it's basically a compromise on autonomy, an unending conflict, hopefully semi-frozen, but semi-frozen conflicts have a way of becoming unfrozen, as we've seen again and again in Kashmir, for example, or war and military victory for Russia, which I hope none of us want. The other thing about, our right, if you like, to speak over the heads of the Ukrainians. Well, we have been asked to admit Ukraine, into our alliances. That automatically gives us a say in the outcome, and of course in so many conflicts around the world. That's why you have mediation efforts. That's why you sometimes have very forceful mediation efforts by the outside world, precisely because the local parties are unable to come to an agreement without it. So there's no good saying that we don't have a role. We do have a role. I'm so sorry, I do have to run, but thank you all so much for a most interesting discussion. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Olga also wanted to respond to the Minsk 2 question, please.
Yeah, very quickly, because I think it's a really good question, because the actual Minsk 2 language talks about special status. It's not that specific, so why does everyone keep talking about this meaning a veto over foreign policy? And the answer to that question is because a lot of Russian officials have made that very clear, that that's what they want. And that's kind of the vision. I would also say that I think that Ukrainians, in shying away from implementing Minsk 2, underestimate themselves a little bit. The notion that, as Anatol suggested, that it's simply reincorporating these territories give you automatically, force you to take in a huge voting bloc that is going to be against everything that Kiev is for. Well, it depends on how you treat them. Right? It depends on what happens next. It depends on the relationship that is built. And I'm also of the belief that Ukraine is a very large, diverse country that would be well served by federalization. I do believe federalization type alternatives as a way to implement Minsk have been proposed and suggested by the Ukrainian government, that kind of we do this throughout the country. And they've gotten a lot of pushback on that from Russia. So, it's not as easy as just, I agree, that's a great plan for Ukraine for all sorts of reasons. Minsk, no Minsk, war, no war, but it's not as simple as that. But in terms of the special status, I do think the Ukrainians underestimate what they could do if they actually work to think about how to reintegrate this territory. And what that would mean, that it's not about taking a poison pill. These are your people. And if you've been fighting a war for 8 years for this territory, consider that maybe you actually, if you want it, that means you have to reintegrate it. And, I do think that that's something I've been talking to Ukrainians about for the entire 8 years. Whatever happens next, right, if they aren't forced to give it up entirely, I think that's something they have to be thinking about.
I think Nikolai also wants to say something about this.
Yes, thank you. Very briefly. Federalism and what the Ukrainian government, federalism is rejected as a concept, as an idea by the Ukrainian government, but they talk instead of a deep decentralization, which you can interpret in a lot of different ways, and they actually encourage a discussion of what that would mean. It does not constitute a veto. In any case, whatever decentralization becomes, and if it were to resemble something along the lines of federalization, that's the end of the process. The process must begin with a discussion of the idea of devolution of powers. Very difficult to swallow for Western Ukrainians. Very difficult. Very difficult to swallow also for people in I should say, key actors, key political actors in Kiev, because it is so much more convenient for them to run the country by appointing all its governors, by appointing everybody, by collecting all the taxes. But, it's a centralized system. Why would they give that power up when the whole reason for grabbing that power, for exercising that power, is to transform the country? They're on a mission, I think, and you have to understand that mission. Now, the veto comes in not in any formal sense, but it is there, it is lurking there clearly, because look at the numbers. Right now, the de facto exclusion of such a large number of people in Eastern Ukraine from the ability to vote in elections has resulted in a guarantee of the current balance having shifted to pro-Maidan forces. We're talking about no elections for either side of the Donbass, not the part controlled, not under Kiev's control, and the part that is controlled by the Kievan government, which is currently under martial law. No votes, no ability to vote if you are a Ukrainian citizen in Crimea or anywhere in Russia, the largest diaspora. All total, this amounts to close to 20% of the available voting population. And I can very well understand, as any political scientist can, why Kiev would not be interested in having these people vote again, because their votes will go overwhelmingly against the current policy. So that is the veto lurking, that if these people then join the political discourse, we know how they'll vote, and that will result in rebalancing that will effectively preclude NATO membership for Ukraine.
Thank you. And it is really sad because the discussion is wonderful, but we already have to start wrapping up. And I would like to give each one of you again the chance to reply to what you've heard or say what's on your mind in reverse order. So Heinz, LUIZA, Olga, Nikolai, and then Ambassador Matlock in the end. Heinz, are you okay?
No, thank you. I spoke enough. I made my point.
Thank you very much. In that case, LUIZA, would you like to?
I'll just be extremely brief because I found the discussion absolutely fascinating and I have learned a lot. And I think, to my mind, I would just, emphasize the need to be very careful about how we specify, who is speaking here. And, the reason I keep stressing the absence of the EU and reducing the EU to NATO, I find it very problematic. Because again, it not only reduces who has the right to speak, as it does in the case of Ukraine, as we've been saying, but it also, immediately reduces the solutions to solely military or defense ones. And there has been a lack of diplomacy. I mean, one of, as Annalena Baerbock heads to Moscow, I mean, one of the points that she made is that for 2 years there have been no discussions. So, it's not a failure of diplomacy. There have not been discussions. There hasn't been, kind of sufficient dialogue. And we need to remember that. So I will just leave it at that.
Thank you. Olga?
Okay, very quickly. And actually, first to respond to LUIZA a little bit, I mean, I do find kind of the EU role in this and the negation of it is interesting, right? Because it was EU association that started all of this. And it is the EU that delivers the sanctions, right, which are a big chunk of the threat. Now, I agree with, I think, everybody, or almost everybody on this panel, in that, the sanctions don't get you what you want, right? It's not that they're necessarily effective in the way that you want them to be effective, but they are the stick that Western states reach for, and it's the EU sanctions that are most important here. NATO membership, I do want to also stress, Ukrainians can all vote unanimously for NATO membership. They still don't get it until the NATO member states unanimously want to give Ukraine membership. And they don't want to have a war with Russia. Now, if they already find themselves in a war with Russia, if they get, if it happens by other means, if another one of these escalations gets them there, it becomes the same thing. But, this is like the Budapest Memorandum and why those were security assurances and not guarantees. It's not because, oh gosh, nobody thought this could happen. It's because everybody knew perfectly well this could happen and they didn't want to have the war. And then would Russia win the war? Does it have enough forces? I mean, I agree with Ambassador Matlock. Yes, they would win the war. Yes, they have enough forces. I would also add, there's a variety of things they could do. They are masked to do a lot, but it is all scalable. They don't have to do it all at once.
Thank you very much. May I just say very quickly that we have one participant also from Odessa, I think, and she keeps pointing out in the chat room that the Donbass population do not make up 30% of Ukrainian voters, and at the best, according to even 2013 numbers, it would be 13.5. And she also made the point in another place that not everybody, all the Russian speakers of these territories are automatically Russophiles. I just want to point this out because it's true. We also don't have a Ukrainian participant here. So for anyone listening, we will catch up on this also with Ukrainian colleagues in the very near future. Nikolai, do you want to add something to the discussion? And I think you're muted. Nikolai, you're still muted.
Yes, sorry. We don't have a formal Ukrainian participant, although I do spend a good part of every year in my residence in Ukraine, but it's only part of the year. And we don't have any participants from Russia either, curiously. Be nice to have the two of them at the same table, don't you think? But I just want to reiterate my main point, which is the conflict over Ukraine is distinct from the conflict within Ukraine. Both are important, but they are separate. Resolving the conflict over Ukraine will not automatically resolve the conflict within Ukraine, whereas I think resolving the conflict within Ukraine will restore agency to Ukrainians and effectively resolve the conflict over Ukraine. That's my only point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In that case, let me wrap up by saying that studying European history, we realize that in regular intervals, we Europeans, all of us, do stupid things, unfortunately. And I hope this is not one of those moments. I do hope that we can this time avoid the spiral. And I thank you all for participating and sharing your thoughts in how to get out of the spiral, or at least not further down to it. And from the part of neutrality studies, thank you for your participation. And Stephanie, please.
Yes. Thank you very much, Pascal. Thanks to all participants. I think it was very interesting. I mean, we talked about historical backgrounds, about sovereignty, about identity question within Ukraine, the role of Russia and the US. So it's just a very broad picture, and I think we can agree upon that we cannot tackle all the issues involved, even though we would like to. So we will keep on working, especially on the topic also in regard of Ukraine, and let's hope that it's going not to be an escalation, a violent escalation. This is a personal hope, working for an institute which is dealing with peace. Thanks a lot. Have a nice evening, morning, night to you, Pascal, and it was a pleasure, and we keep you updated. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.